Thursday, April 12, 2018.
Hi, I have two gentlemen at my cafe that are refusing to make a purchase or leave. I'm at the Starbucks at 18th and Spruce.
All right, please, I'll be on as soon as possible.
Thank you.
In the spring of 2018, a downtown Philadelphia Starbucks made national news when two black men were arrested and escorted out by police.
On April 12th, Rashawn Nelson and Dante Robinson were led away in handcuffs after a manager called the police to have them removed.
Nelson and Robinson had been sitting in a Starbucks but refused to make a purchase. They were technically violating Starbucks rules. When they refused to leave, the store manager had them arrested. The arrest set off national protests.
Nationwide.
What do we want? Justice! When do we want it? Now!
Starbucks immediately apologizes. CEO Kevin Johnson announces a nationwide closure of Starbucks stores for an all-day, company-wide racial bias training.
We are closing all 8,000 stores in the United States.
The manager who made the call is fired.
Well, that manager is no longer in that store.
And so is her boss. For the public, this is how the drama concluded, with two white employees being fired for racism in yet another brief chapter in corporate civil rights history. But this isn't the whole story. One of those fired employees responds by suing Starbucks. In court documents, a Starbucks manager who wasn't even present during the incident claims she was fired because she's white. She claims she was a public relations sacrifice, a white pawn that Starbucks offered up in order to convince the community it had properly responded to the incident. And she wins. The Starbucks employee's victory is a glimpse into the future. A future where these lawsuits are going to become a lot more common. This is the story of how diversity, equity, and inclusion as we know it is coming to an end. How the racial quotas, the preferential treatment, and the public relations sacrifices are all about to come crashing down. But first, a reminder of how we got here.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of...
In 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act. It includes a section called Title VII, which prohibits employers from discriminating on the basis of race, sex, nationality, or religion. Title VII was originally designed to stamp out anti-black racism in the workplace, to finally give black workers a fair shot in private industry.
This is 10 years after Brown versus the Board of Education was decided. And what Congress realized that the country needed was pure equality in the workforce. The key principle behind the Civil Rights Act was colorblindness. It's that you'd be treated the same no matter what the color of your skin was. Judge people based on the content of their character, how good they're going to be at their job, not the color of their skin.
Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions. Divisions which have lasted all...
It also didn't mean that you can go out there and do affirmative action, that you can give someone a leg up or a leg down.
In the decade since its passage, layers upon layers of new law would twist Title VII, transforming it from a law that eliminated racial hiring and into one that demanded it. March 1971, the Supreme Court decides a case called Griggs versus Duke Power Company. Duke Power Company had a policy requiring a standardized test and a high school diploma in their hiring practice. This hiring practice, though not intentionally racist, ends up disproportionately hiring whites.
The court was looking at employment tests. Can an employer have an employment test if it disparately impacted African Americans or any other minority group?
The court's ruling introduced the concept of disparate impact. This meant that employment requirements that produce racial disparities, even if it wasn't their intent, could be illegal. With the new doctrine of disparate impact, the court rules that Duke Power Company's practice violated civil rights law and forces them to scrap their policy.
Instead of looking at whether you intended to discriminate against someone, we're looking at the outcomes. They said that if something you're doing, even if you're not intending to discriminate against anyone because of their race, has some sort of disparate impact on a particular group, that might be illegal.
In other words, if white candidates do better than black candidates on an employment test, and it leads to a racial disparity, even if that wasn't the employer's intent, they could still be sued for violating the Civil Rights Act. The invention of disparate impact exploded civil rights law and marked a major pivot away from anti-discrimination in favor of chasing equality of outcomes. 2 years later, a man named Alan Bakke applies for medical school at the University of California, Davis, and is rejected twice. A less qualified black applicant is admitted instead under the school's affirmative action program.
And so you had a man named Alan Bakke, and he'd applied to medical school 2 times and been rejected at this particular medical school, even though his grades and his MCAT score were higher.
Bakke sues, claiming racial discrimination. 5 years later, the Supreme Court hands down Regents of the University of California v. Bakke. The case ends with Davis being allowed to keep its affirmative action program, but the court provides new justification for it. The atmosphere of speculation, experiment, and creation, so essential to the quality of higher education, is widely believed to be promoted by a diverse student body.
And this was a watershed moment because up until that time, affirmative action was premised on remedying the prior effects of segregation and racism against African Americans. It was a remedial measure. But once Justice Powell said the only legal basis for having an affirmative action is diversity, we saw a variety of universities start saying it. And they said it over and over and over again.
1 year later, the Supreme Court decides United Steelworkers versus Weber. A Louisiana chemical company running an affirmative action program had been passing over senior white employees for promotions in favor of less qualified black employees. A white employee named Brian Weber sues.
The Supreme Court says the literal construction of the civil rights laws would say this is illegal. The text of the statute would say this is illegal. But the spirit of the statute says we're going to allow this.
The decision effectively blesses the modern conception of affirmative action in the workplace and embraces the idea of special treatment based on race.
After extraordinary debate and negotiation, we have reached an agreement on a civil rights bill.
In 1991, Congress passes yet another Civil Rights Act.
This is a very good bill. Let me repeat, this is a very good bill.
The key effect of the bill was dramatically expanding the damages that employees who claim discrimination can collect.
The bill would make it easier for victims of racial or sexual discrimination to sue their bosses and collect damages.
Well, the 1991 Civil Rights Act allowed people to get a jury trial, so that was very significant because juries can be very sympathetic to employees. But the other thing it did, it also allowed people to sue for emotional distress damages.
Emotional distress as a standard means that small micro-offenses can amount to a Title VII violation. Individual small offenses or racy cartoons or off-color jokes can add up to a hostile work environment, and the employer can be sued for discrimination and be forced to pay a large fine.
They made it easier to bring these sorts of lawsuits. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1991 increased the litigation risk to companies across the nation.
In the wake of the new law, the number of Title VII lawsuits jumps dramatically, and the average settlement clocks in at $40,000. Some of the biggest corporations in the world end up paying large sums for violating civil rights law. Coca-Cola pays out $200 million. Bank of America, $210 million. The final plank in the modern civil rights regime governing private employers came in 1997 from the Office of Management and Budget, the office tasked with helping the president oversee the federal budget.
In 1997, the Office of Management and Budget puts out a directive to companies, to federal contractors that says you have to collect certain kinds of racial data. There's 5 categories: Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. Another one is Asians. Another one is whites, another one is African Americans, and another one is for Native Alaskans and other indigenous people in the United States. Now, the categories make no sense, okay? You've got people from China being considered the same as Japan. At the end of the day, these categories are arbitrary. Seem like they're plucked from thin air.
Companies who do business with the federal government are now tasked with bean counting and categorizing the racial makeup of their staff.
And so you've got categories that are basically made up in the Washington, D.C. area that don't map on to people's actual ethnicities, being used to potentially impose liability on companies.
This OMB directive is why companies today carry the checkbox, the categorization system that measures and counts the racial composition of their staff. This is how an act of Congress, intended to enshrine a colorblind America, instead engineered a race-obsessed nation. To help businesses operate in this legal minefield, a new fixture in the American C-suite is born.
I'm Melanie Parker, Google's Chief Diversity Officer.
Hi, my name is Megan Hogan, and I'm the Chief Diversity Officer of Goldman Sachs.
What was your exact role at Lockheed Martin?
The inaugural Head of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion.
As the legal threat of Title VII comes into focus, this new role comes to command tremendous power in American corporate life. And in May of 2020, the power of these czars moves to an entirely new level. In the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, corporate America ramps up its racial engineering efforts. Bloomberg News examined 2021 hiring data from 88 S&P 100 companies. Out of 323,000 new hires, 94% of them were people of color. In a nation that's 58% white, just 6% of new hires were themselves white. A perfect case study of how modern corporate diversity plays out can be found in the streaming giant Netflix. First, Netflix has its own diversity czar.
I'm Brene Myers, VP of Inclusion Strategy for Netflix.
Second, Myers closely tracks the racial composition of the company.
Of our U.S. workforce, 52.920.8% is made up of people from one or more historically excluded ethnic and/or racial backgrounds. This is a slight increase from 52.30.5% in 2021.
Netflix spends enormous amounts of money on programs intended to improve the company's diversity figures.
People are recognizing that we're one of the biggest populations in the entire United States, and we demand attention and representation and for our voices to be heard.
Third, the company routinely hires outside anti-racism consultants, including white fragility author Robin DiAngelo.
To be white in so many ways is to be raised to be functionally illiterate on the topic of race.
Fourth, Netflix finances flashy marketing campaigns to advertise its commitment to inclusivity and diversity.
What does being black mean to you?
Fifth, the company regularly hires and promotes based on race, not merit. A former executive at the company told us that the diversity philosophy is omnipresent in hiring meetings. Quote, "I recall the process where we had 2 finalists for an open job. One was ranked more highly than the other on our assessments, but we seriously considered the less qualified candidate because of her race." The problem with the DEI regime, created by a misguided interpretation of the Civil Rights Act, is that it demands diversity at the expense of merit. People are hired and promoted almost exclusively because of their skin color, not because of their abilities. When people are elevated to positions they're not qualified for, bad things happen.
It's my personal preference to not to speak publicly about the case. I like to keep my private life private.
Oh, but you know, it's not a private matter when it goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. Do you plan to go to medical school?
Yes, I do plan to go in the fall.
This is Alan Bakke, the man who was denied admission by UC Davis Medical School because he was white. And Bakke's spot was given to a specific person, a man by the name of Patrick Chavis. By the mid-1990s, Patrick Chavis had become a mascot for affirmative action. The late Senator Ted Kennedy called Chavis a perfect example of just how well affirmative action worked. Chavis even made the cover of New York Times Magazine. Chavis finished his residency in 1981, and he immediately starts running into problems. He spends the 80s receiving complaints from colleagues for his aggressive approach in his work as an OBGYN. By the early 90s, Chavis had begun practicing plastic surgery, and right away started racking up complaints. By '94, he was under investigation by the California Medical Board for repeatedly botching liposuction surgeries. In 1996, a 35-year-old woman goes under Chavis's knife and suffers significant blood loss. Chavis sends her home in spite of her condition. By the time she makes it to emergency care, her body has already succumbed to infections, and she collapses in her own blood. She dies. Chavis loses his medical license, but he continues to practice illegally in South Central Los Angeles. Tragedy would cut short Chavis's legal troubles. In the summer of 2002, while walking to his car after buying an ice cream cone, Chavis is killed by 3 carjackers. His legacy lays bare the consequences of elevating the unqualified.
When you start making decisions based on things other than merit, you wind up with people who sometimes aren't qualified to do the job.
This regime of racial preference and balancing continues long after Chavis. But then, a bombshell ruling changes everything.
Breaking news, the Supreme Court with a major ruling on affirmative action.
The U.S. Supreme Court today dealt a major blow to affirmative.
The Supreme Court has just issued a pair of opinions.
The ruling means that any school using race as an admissions factor will have to stop immediately.
The Supreme Court hands down Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard. A group of Asian students claim that Harvard's admissions policies discriminate against Asians. A study by Princeton researchers found that Asian applicants needed to score a jaw-dropping 450 points higher on their SATs than black students in order to gain admission to colleges like Harvard. In an effort to racially balance its incoming classes, Harvard had been employing something called a personality score, a subjective score given to applicants that weighs heavily on their overall chances of getting into Harvard. Asian students systematically received the lowest scores, while black students received the highest.
What the United States Supreme Court said is that the affirmative action programs were invalid.
The Harvard case was a landmark case. The Chief Justice's opinion says eliminating racial discrimination, and he considers affirmative action to be racial discrimination, means eliminating all of it.
Today's decision marks the promise of a new beginning, a resurgence of the principles of the American dream, and a return to the egalitarian principles for all.
The public fails to notice the magnitude of this decision. For half a century, civil rights law has demanded employers hire, promote, and fire based on race. In an instant, the Harvard decision renders all of this illegal. Employers may not have found this out yet, but they're in for a rude awakening.
Considering race. Well, the Supreme Court has now said you cannot consider race in any way, shape, or form, and if you do, you'll be violating this ruling and the U.S. Constitution.
Companies that think they can go on with what they've been doing are opening themselves up to massive liability.
What happened here is a glimpse of what's to come. May 2018. Shannon Phillips, the manager overseeing the Philadelphia region of Starbucks stores, is fired. Court documents reveal she was completely uninvolved with the incident. She wasn't at the store that day and hadn't been aware of the 911 call. Phillips sues, claiming Starbucks discriminated against her as a PR sacrifice. More importantly, she points out that the district manager who directly supervises the store was the next most obvious person to fire. But Starbucks didn't fire him because he's black. Phillips argues that Starbucks had decided to punish white employees who worked in the area in an effort to convince the community that it had properly responded to the incident. Phillips claims that race was a determinative factor in her termination and that her Title VII rights had been violated. After nearly 4 years of litigation, a New Jersey jury rules in her favor and awards her a $26 million judgment.
This morning, a $25.6 million victory. A New Jersey jury unanimously siding with the former regional manager, Shannon Phillips, claiming her race was a determinative factor in Starbucks' decision to fire her.
And people who continue to discriminate against their employees do so at their peril in the aftermath of the Harvard decision. And so anyone who continues to engage in this conduct is running a very real risk. Make no mistake, if corporate America continues to play by the old playbook, we will see many, many more of these very large verdicts on behalf of employees across the country. They're going to be sued, and they're going to lose, and they're potentially going to be subject to crippling penalties.
The fallout of the Harvard decision already has companies being sued, with several major cases underway.
People shouldn't be judged based on the color of their skin in this country. But there will be holdouts, and those holdouts, some of them will be punished.